This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Walter Koenig, Chekhov from Star Trek, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Welcome everyone to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I am Tony Black, as ever, one of your hosts, and I'm joined, as ever, by my co-host tonight, Duncan Barrett.
Hi, Tony.
Hi, Duncan. We have chosen to do a special episode for this one. Quite somber special episode, a supplemental early on in our run that we've inserted to discuss a topic which is a broad one within Star Trek, but has a real life relevance, as in the last just over a week from the point you'll be listening to this, were the bombings at Manchester Arena in the United Kingdom, the result of yet another act of terrorism on the UK, and obviously which we've seen in the United States and other countries around the world. And we thought that we were already planning an episode to discuss the nature of modern terrorism in relation to Star Trek, and we thought this might be an opportune time to bring that discussion forward a little bit and talk about these issues in as sensitive a way as we possibly can. But I think we're at a point, and we were talking about this earlier, Duncan, weren't we? I think we're at a point where we kind of need to talk about this, don't we?
Yeah, well, I think both of us, after we got the news on, was it Tuesday morning this week, I think, about the bombing, we were messaging back and forth a bit about partly some of the coverage that we've been seeing. Because, I don't know about you, my sort of feeling is, obviously it goes without saying, this was a truly awful thing that's happened, a terrible attack. But I was also sort of interested from, looking at these Star Trek episodes from a kind of cultural perspective, looking at how we try to make sense of terrorism, how we try to tell stories about terrorism. I was kind of struck by, listening to the radio and TV coverage after the attacks, that with all these attacks, and unfortunately they've become, relatively frequent now. We had the attack on Westminster Bridge only probably a month ago or something like that, fairly recently anyway. But you always get the same responses, that people have these kind of sort of knee-jerk responses that they trot out. And I don't necessarily mean that they're bad responses, but I think there's an element of, we go into kind of autopilot when we try to talk about these things, maybe because they're very difficult to talk about. We don't know what to say. We feel like we have to say something, but we're not quite sure what the right thing is to say. But it just made me sort of question some of the kind of ideas that I was hearing coming out, that, I've heard every time there's one of these terrorist attacks, and I just sort of wonder, are we just kind of repeating the same ideas without really thinking much about them? So it sort of made me think maybe this was the time when we should, try and have this conversation when it's kind of has that kind of freshness and that relevance to the kind of conversations that people are unfortunately having in their ordinary lives.
Well, it's a conversation that I think people have been having significantly since 9/11 really, which is now obviously 16 years ago, the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. And I think terrorism, of course, existed before then, but I think it's been amplified in the last, getting on for 20 years, really, in the responses that governments have had, that people have had, the fear of what terrorism has become. And I think what we wanted to talk about in this episode, and as I say, we did already have this episode roughly planned. We were going to do this relatively soon. It was one of the early ideas in Primitive Culture that we wanted to explore, which is, how does Star Trek deal with terrorism in a world and a future which seemingly has gotten past these issues, and the nature of what exactly terrorism is. How can we look to Star Trek, and how can we see terrorism reflected in some of those stories And how do we see it change? And how do we see it evolve, unfortunately, alongside terrorism? And I think after Manchester, and obviously, as you mentioned, Westminster, it feels like so many people are having conversations. And as you say, people are going over the same kind of things. We're not saying we're going to come up with the answer and to understand, because it's extremely complicated. But I think looking at some of these Star Trek stories historically, it gives different kind of approaches and different viewpoints on what terrorism is, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And also it gives us a sense of the way that our ideas about terrorism, I suppose, have changed over time as the kind of terrorism that we face has changed. I mean, you know, for both of us being British, kind of growing up in the 80s and going into the 90s, you know, obviously for a long period, for people of our generation, particularly slightly older generations, terrorism was about Irish terrorism, it was about the IRA. And obviously Star Trek dealt with that. And then later on, as you said, since 9/11, I think things have changed, and terrorism very much, you know, typically is Islamist terrorism. And it's quite a different breed of terrorism, I think, in a sense. I mean, I think possibly with the IRA, you know, whether you agreed with any of their goals or anything they wanted or not, or, you know, however you sort of felt on that spectrum, I suppose it was easy to understand what they wanted. You know, we did kind of understand that they had a clear sort of platform, in a sense. They had clear goals that were, you know, maybe not politically you might say they weren't possible, but they were kind of comprehensible, and they were understandable. And I think one of the things with the more recent kind of terrorism since 9/11 is there is a real sort of confusion about what it's really about. And this was what really struck me listening to the coverage in the, you know, hours after we kind of learned of this latest attack, was all these people, you know, speaking to what the terrorists want and telling people, well, you mustn't do this because that's what the terrorists want. You know, if you cancel your plans because you don't feel safe going to, you know, a show the next week or whatever, you shouldn't do that because that's what the terrorists want. Or, you know, even we had in the UK, Katie Hopkins tweeting these awful comments. She called for a final solution to the problem, you know, basically kind of effectively advocating genocide in a sense. I mean, for the American listeners, if you don't know who Katie Hopkins is, she's the kind of British Milo, I suppose, a real controversialist, really, and a pretty unpleasant character. You know, I would not at all defend what she was saying, but at the same time there were all these people saying, oh, she's exactly what the terrorists want. They want to stoke up those kind of attitudes, they want to stoke up someone like her. And I was just sort of thinking, I'm not sure if that's true. You know, the people who are doing this, you know, these young men who are doing these awful things, are they really thinking about Katie Hopkins and what kind of reaction she's going to have?
Yeah.
You know, is that part of their plan? Or is it just that everything gets sort of subsumed into this kind of idea about, well, the terrorists are thinking this way, and you know, we have to think this way. You know, even this, the rhetoric that comes out time and again that they're cowards. Well, I think that's a problematic thing to do. I mean, with this latest attack, you know, rightly, a lot of attention has been placed on the fact that the targets that they've chosen are, you know, even more shockingly than in past attacks. I mean, they're not even, you know, adults, they're not even people of our age, they're kids, essentially. They're deliberately targeting children, particularly girls, essentially, in terms of the kind of demographic of the people at this concert. And all these people were saying, oh, they're cowards because they're targeting little girls who can't defend themselves. Well, I think obviously it's unspeakably horrific that they're targeting little girls, but I don't know that that's really about cowardice. I think it might be more honest to say that what people would used to say, to call them monsters, you know, there's a kind of moral question there. It's not really about cowardice, but again, I think sort of saying that they're cowards is a way of kind of, it's almost a kind of reassuring notion. And I think in some ways all these ideas, you know, don't cancel your plans, that's playing into what they want. Don't give publicity to this idea, that's playing into what they want, and so on. I mean, terrorism is terrifying, you know, that's the reality of it. And I think in some of these kind of knee-jerk reactions, even the positive ones, I mean, the other thing I've seen a lot is this quotation about looking for the helpers. And obviously we've seen these quite inspiring stories of, you know, the taxi drivers offering free rides and the woman who was out all night helping these kids and so on. And that's very important. And that, you know, those are sort of small glimmers of hope in this awful situation. But at the same time, when people are telling you, you know, focus on this, don't focus on that, you know, think about the positive, don't focus on the negative, I sort of feel like, well, actually, you know, something awful, unspeakably awful has happened, and people should be allowed to engage with that. They shouldn't be told that they have to focus on something else.
I think it's the need for people to create a narrative that makes sense. It's the need for people to look at these events, which seem to make no sense, you know, to the majority of people trying to live their lives in a normal way. A man going into the train station after an Ariana Grande gig and blowing up 22 children, or I know it wasn't entirely children, but you know, complete innocence. It makes no sense. You know, it absolutely makes no sense in terms of the way we view our way of life and our morals and our values and, you know, the sanctity of human life. So we need to try and put some kind of structure into it of he must be a coward, or they must want this, or when the reality is we don't know. We don't know what these people want. We don't know what's going through their head. It could be different for every single one of them. There could be reasons that we can't even fathom. It could simply be, you know, I hate to trivialise, but it could simply be a bit like the Joker in The Dark Knight. They just want to see the world burn. It could simply be that kind. There mightn't be no logical structure to it. And that's the scary part.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing is I sort of wonder, you know, on one level, are we trying to kind of rationalise something that is essentially quite an emotional thing in a sense? I mean, we're sort of ignoring the level of hatred. And, you know, I think I mentioned this back in our first episode, actually, when we were touching briefly on the Westminster attack. You know, that kind of feeling, and it's difficult. I find it difficult, but, you know, the fact is, people like you and me, the people who commit these atrocities, they don't think we deserve to live. You know, it's not necessarily that. I don't think it's necessarily a case as it might have been, you know, maybe in some of the Star Trek examples that we'll talk about, and that people might have felt in the past of, you know, well, maybe the means justify the ends or whatever. I think there's a more kind of fundamental and more irrational element to it than that, possibly. And, you know, these attempts to kind of rationalise it are not always going to get at that. I was kind of struck, actually, by something that a lady that I interviewed for one of my books a few years ago said, and this was a few years ago, but this was a woman who she'd grown up in London, in London in the Second World War. She'd lived through the Blitz. She'd been bombed out of her house several times. You know, she had friends who'd been killed in the war, and then she ended up going over to America because she married an American, and she was, you know, she was in America for 9/11, and she actually coincidentally was back in London during the 7/7 attack. She'd gone to, she'd served in the ATS, the Women's Army, during the war, and she'd gone to see the unveiling of a memorial to the women of the Women's Forces, which I think was like it may even have been that day or the day before. So she was in London anyway, and so she was kind of caught up in some of the mayhem around those attacks. And I just thought it was interesting, her way of sort of comprehending it was quite different. She basically said, as far as she was concerned, it was the same thing. You know, she saw it, and I think this was partly coming from a kind of maybe a religious or a spiritual perspective, but she basically said she felt there was always evil in the world and it took different forms. And as far as she was concerned, you know, when she was a young woman, it was the Nazis and they fought to defeat that. And these days the evil has returned with a different, you know, sort of with a different face in a sense. So that was her way of looking at it, was in this kind of, I don't know how to describe that, but a very different way from this kind of attempt to rationalise and work out a sort of mind game in a sense. They want you to think this, so you have to force yourself to think something else. And it's all this kind of thing about, you know, it's all focused, I suppose, on the reaction, isn't it? It's all focused on how are you supposed to respond to this thing that's happened. You know, the goal is to terrify you or whatever. So how are you going to not be terrified? How are you going to prove that, you know, your way of life is unaffected and so on? And you know, I think it's a very difficult question. I can understand why people say that they don't want to, they sort of feel with that kind of Blitz spirit, going back to the Blitz, I suppose, that, you know, you carry on with your life and so on. But actually one of the more interesting discussions that I heard on the radio in recent days was it was a phone in, and someone had phoned in and was very much saying this, you know, don't cancel your plans, don't you know, carry on with life as usual. And the host of the radio show was actually saying, well, I'm not going to tell people to do that. You know, I don't want the responsibility of telling people that they should do that if they feel they're at risk. You know, people can make their own decisions on something like that, and that should be a kind of personal decision, not something that's sort of imposed in a sense. And
I suppose the flip side of looking at that is by going on with life as normal, by, you know, carrying on, and as you say, you know, that level of spirit, and we've seen that in Manchester over the last few days, you know, a real coming together of the people in the city, which is fantastic. But at the same time, does just getting on with everything and not letting in inverted commas, not letting them win, does it in some respect ignore the deeper reasons for why this has happened? Does it, to an extent, provide us with an excuse to, while obviously we mourn, while obviously, you know, we consider everything, by getting on with it, are we trying to think, okay, we don't understand, all we can do is carry on, when there might be some good and some logic in actually pausing and letting us properly have these conversations and thinking about it and trying to, and not listening to the rhetoric we hear in newspapers and not listening to some of the hardline right-wing propaganda that we hear, you know, on both sides of the pond these days when these things happen, but actually stopping and considering, can we try and figure out why this problem isn't going away, why it's getting worse, why it's magnifying, why we feel at risk, and and what can we do? What can we try and do as a society, as a collective global society, to deal with this? And I think this is one of the reasons I think we wanted to do this podcast, because in Star Trek there are good examples of different kinds of terrorism that go into this kind of area. The first one was you briefly touched on earlier when you mentioned the IRA, and the first one was the third season of The Next Generation episode, The High Ground, which is in many respects a transfer of the idea of what the IRA is, the Irish Republican Army. And in the higher ground, you have the Enterprise going to a planet called Rutia 4, where the actual government have been in conflict with a group of rebel separatists called the Ansata, led by quite a charismatic leader called Finn. And the Ansata, they're rebel separatists, and they want to have their voice heard, and they've been fighting this pitched battle, and they've been conducting terrorist attacks on the seemingly peaceful, the seemingly, you know, civilized society on this planet. And that, as an analogy for what the IRA were, is a very, very different kind of thing, isn't it, Duncan, from the kind of terrorism, to an extent, that we're experiencing and we've just experienced today.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd say, you know, The High Ground, I mean, I think it's quite a good episode in a way. It's quite a measured episode. It shows both sides of the coin. It kind of debates the issues in a kind of sort of traditional Next Generation way, in a sense. It kind of is, you know, going into the issues, taking it quite seriously. I mean, it's a serious topic, but and kind of trying to offer quite a measured way of looking at it. This episode was actually banned by the BBC for many years, and they always said, I don't know if this is true, not so much because of the kind of allegorical significance of the episode, but because of this single line in it where Data says, he basically says, oh, well, you know, the IRA basically achieved what they wanted in, I think, 2024.
2024,
is, you know, is coming up pretty close now. And obviously, you know, in the real world, that situation has, you know, been resolved, you know, hopefully, or is you know, on the course
whole
to being resolved, at least, generally speaking, been resolved, you know, earlier than that and in quite a different way. But the way that Data presents it is basically, well, they won, they got what they wanted, you know, by implication. Well, he calls it the Irish reunification, doesn't he? So by implication, they got the British out of Ireland, which is obviously not the kind of more compromise-like solution that was kind of ultimately found in the real world. But so obviously it was a very topical issue at the time. I mean, this episode was written in 1990. It was written by Melinda Snodgrass, who also was behind The Measure of a Man, another very interesting, sort of serious, thoughtful episode. And one thing I was quite surprised by is actually originally, apparently, it wasn't going to be focusing, or it wasn't going to be a kind of analogue for the Irish situation. It was going to be more about the American War of Independence. And there are still some lines in there that kind of harken back to that conflict and to that relationship. And I suppose maybe there is a connection between those two things, because, you know, for you and me growing up in Britain, seeing things from a British perspective, you know, we've probably, you know, whatever our personal feelings might be about the complex issue of Northern Ireland, we've certainly grown up in a culture and with a kind of political environment where there's a position towards that issue that is very different to maybe what it might be in America. I mean, I know that a lot of Americans were more sympathetic to the sort of Irish Republicans than, you know, people in Britain were, partly because I think they felt this sort of, that there was a similarity in the sense, you know, America had gained its independence from Britain in the past, and there maybe was, they felt there was an element of that there. And also, you know, on the face of it, it's one of those situations where, as difficult and complicated as it might be politically, you can kind of understand these are basically, you know, and in the episode, these are separatists. They're very clear what they want. They want autonomy. They want self-determination. They want all these things that in principle, you know, basically sound like a good thing. I mean, really, the issue in the episode is about It's not so much about their goals, which seem reasonable. It's about their methods and whether it's acceptable for them to use terrorist methods to try to get what they want. And, to try to... Basically, the man's plan is to effectively draw the Federation into their conflict by attacking the Federation, by destroying the Enterprise. And his idea is that then the Federation will be kind of implicated in this situation. And because they will be keen to find a diplomatic solution, they will kind of put pressure on them to get around the negotiation table. So it's very much a kind of means to an end. It's very much a kind of temporary situation. He's not trying to annihilate the society or anything. He wants to strengthen his hand so that he can go in and negotiate with them and hopefully get what he wants.
Exactly. And the interesting thing you mentioned about how the IRA, which is obviously the analogue, as we've said, but you've mentioned how the IRA is viewed differently. I mean, I remember growing up in the 1980s and the 1990s. When I was a child, terrorism meant the IRA. It didn't mean anything else to me. That was the first understanding of what I knew from what I heard from my parents, from what I heard from the media, from what I read as a child. Terrorism was the IRA. And I remember, I wasn't alive at the time, but in the city I live in Birmingham, in the UK, and it wasn't just in Birmingham this happened, but there was a series of horrendous bombings of quite often pubs. One in particular, which killed a lot of people, and a place called New Street, which is the main thoroughfare in Birmingham. Place I know extremely well, place I've grown up, and it happened, I think it was in the 70s, there was a lot of this separatist bombing, and there was something that quite chilled me to the bone was my mother told me that the night this happened, she was meant to go to that pub. And it was only because a friend of hers cancelled by some kind of serendipitous, stroke of fate that she didn't go in the end. And obviously I then turned around and said, well, there's a very good chance I may not have been born had you gone that night, because a lot of people died or people were maimed. And it was, by the sound of it, a horrendous time. And there have been subsequent, there's been a lot in the press about the Birmingham Six, who were the bombers and things like this, and all kinds of things. So for me, there's a very personal connection, like a lot of people in the UK, the mainland UK, of the IRA being a horrible force, of not being sympathetic whatsoever, because what they did was try and kill us, seemingly. They were trying to kill us, when the reality is they were making a very different point. Their goals and their reasoning was about the reunification of their homeland. But as a child and as a mainland Englander, frankly, what do I care about that? I'm seeing people be bombed. I'm seeing people be killed. What for? And that's a really vivid kind of thing. So the viewpoint, that's the other thing about terrorism. It can be viewed very differently from very different places and very different perspectives.
It's interesting you say that, because you see, my sort of memory of the IRA bombings, and I mean, I remember that bomb going off in Canary Wharf, and that would be the sort of mid-90s, I think, and that was quite a shocking situation. You see, my sort of feeling was like in the 90s, around the sort of time this episode was going, that was more typical in that, generally they would phone in warnings when these bombs were going to go off, and some people might be killed, but I suppose compared to, say the kind of terrorism we have these days, where the goal usually seems to be to kill as many people as possible, that certainly towards the end of that period, and maybe that's because their kind of strategy changed or whatever, it seemed like they were, they wanted to cause mayhem and destruction and to scare people. There was the kind of terror element, but actually they did take, some measures to limit the loss of human life to a certain extent, and certainly. I don't want to get into defending the IRA. That's not, really what I'm trying to do.
No.
But I suppose, I don't know, it does make me wonder, there are different kinds of terrorists. There are people who are doing things for different reasons. They have different goals. They probably have different feelings about what they're doing. For some of them, they're probably, as in this episode of The Next Generation, the guy is not totally unfeeling. I mean, he is kind of hardened to an extent. He's willing to do terrible things. I mean, when he finds out that, because he has sort of kidnapped Beverly basically and is debating a lot of these issues with her, when he finds out that her son is on the Enterprise, he says, oh, kind of what a shame basically that I'm going to have to kill your son. He's still going to do it, but he's sort of basically says, oh, I wish you hadn't told me that. I wish that didn't have to happen. So he's kind of convinced himself that these appalling acts are justifiable, but at the same time, only as a means to an end. In the abstract, he does recognise that they're kind of awful on one level as well, which is very different, I think, from the situation of someone who just feels that they're kind of doing the right thing by killing people, and it's different, in fact, from some of the other later Star Trek episodes that we might look at, which sort of tie into more the kind of terrorism that we've had, I suppose, since 9/11, the more kind of Islamist terrorism, which often at least is represented as being more of a kind of attack on a way of life or a culture or a kind of a sort of ideological battle, rather than a dispute over territory or over land, or these kind of traditional causes of conflict.
What the High Ground does, and what we later see quite heavily, I think, in Deep Space Nine with the Bajoran issue, is this idea of there's the saying, isn't the one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So in the case of Finn from the High Ground, and in the case of someone like Kira and Shakar and all of these people who fought in the Bajoran resistance and were bombing targets and things like this, Cardassian targets and stuff like that, they would be considered heroes for the Bajorans. They would be considered freedom fighters, resistance fighters and everything like that. But from a Cardassian point of view, they would have been terrorists. They would have been outlaw terrorists bombing innocent civilians, probably more military, installations and things like that. But they would still be killing people indiscriminately. So there's an interesting conversation to be had about the response, isn't there, as well, and whether or not you consider, a freedom fighter different from an actual terrorist. And Deep Space Nine gets into this in a few interesting ways, I think. I mean, a good example that you brought up earlier when we were talking was Homefront and Paradise Lost, which is the season 4 two-parter where Sisko goes back to Earth when he finds out there's a changeling plot underway, and they're having to basically declare martial law on Earth, and there's an internal kind of Starfleet power grapple conspiracy going on there as well. But it is that the one thing Deep Space Nine does really well with the changelings is that fear of the enemy within and not knowing who to trust and having to change your way of life. And and we'd never seen Earth in that context in the Star Trek universe before Homefront. Seeing the armed guys on the streets, the fear of who your neighbour is, and that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing we get now in the response after a terror attack. You only have to look at the major cities in the UK now this week. After Manchester, there are armed people on the streets. There are police. There is a heightened response. It's like, as our Prime Minister did, heightened the critical, the level to critical. And that's effectively what they do in Homefront when they're faced with this problem. So it's Deep Space Nine before 9/11 does get into this, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Deep Space Nine, I suppose, is a very prescient series in many ways in relation to those kind of things. And I think it's true, we see, we don't thankfully have martial law in Britain at the moment, but it's true, we do have the army taking over police roles, and on the streets with guns. And it's a difficult issue, I suppose. I mean, it sort of goes back to what I was saying about, what is the right response, this kind of fixation on our response. How do we, what's the right balance between changing our way of life and, potentially taking risks and so on. On the radio this morning, I heard an interview with David Blunkett, who was the former Home Secretary here. And he was talking about, because they were debating this issue about soldiers on the streets, and he was saying there was a time when I think around the time of the Iraq War after 9/11, there were concerns about potential missile attacks on planes leaving Heathrow Airport. And he said basically they decided to send in not just soldiers but tanks to the airport. Now, I don't know what the tanks were actually going to do. I think it was a sort of probably a symbolic thing as much as anything else. But he said he was really angry about it. And he even though he was Home Secretary, he couldn't actually command them to leave, essentially. But he said he rang up and in very strong terms, he was basically saying, look, you're terrifying people even more than is appropriate in a sense, and just putting these vehicles there, it kind of sends a certain message, and it's the wrong, as far as he was concerned, it was the wrong response. It was sort of deliberately provoking a reaction that was kind of the opposite of the what he would see as the right way to proceed. And obviously once you get in Homefront and Paradise Lost, you also get into kind of restrictions on civil liberties. You get in a situation with martial law, you have a curfew, you have kind of, there is a danger that you go down a road where you're kind of, I suppose, the free society that you're trying to protect becomes compromised by taking those decisions. I mean, on the other hand, I don't know about you, personally, I know some people don't like having their bags searched or sort of feel affronted by extra security measures. I usually feel quite reassured by those things. I sort of be more worried if if people don't seem to be interested in searching your bags or whatever. I don't see that as a kind of as sort of spoiling my way of life in some ways. I I think I'm a bit more sort of pragmatic on that kind of thing. But I do understand there's a continuum, there's a kind of, it's all about kind of what's proportionate, what's appropriate. And these things are very difficult to know. And, the security services obviously know a lot more than we do and, are involved in a lot of activities that we know nothing about in trying to prevent other attacks and so on. But, they don't know everything and they get taken by surprise. And, and they and the politicians and everyone is trying to sort of find a balance in a sense of, trying to sort of preserve that way of life, but also trying to keep people safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it interesting that in the case of Homefront and Paradise Lost, that they got into this at the time they did. This was 1996, 97. If you look at it in political terms and in sociological terms, it was quite a peaceful time, really. We were between wars. It was pre 9/11. We passed the first Iraq War. There was a fairly stable presidency in the US. There was New Labour that had just begun, a seemingly bright and beautiful future for the UK. It didn't seem like a time where people were terrified. People were living in fear. So as you said, there was a certain prescience about Deep Space Nine in that it almost felt like that storyline was looking over the next hill, because that is exactly the kind of world that we start to see reflected in later Star Trek as we get past 2001 and we get into the world beyond 9/11, which obviously affected a great deal of television, and there's some really interesting ideas discussed in terms of, obviously, as I've mentioned a couple of times before, I do an X-Files podcast. There's been an interesting point made on that of that the X-Files started to lose popularity after 9/11 because people didn't want to distrust their government anymore. And you had TV shows such as 24 or Alias where the American government were the good guys. And if there were conspirators or there were people, working against them, it wasn't the Americans. It would be someone inside. It would be a Russian spy. It would be that kind of thing. It would be... Whereas the X-Files was all about your government not working in your best interests, and now it's interesting that show is now coming back and he's tapping back into that zeitgeist. But Star Trek almost seemed at that time to be operating in a different way, in that it wanted to look at these issues through Enterprise, especially in more of a direct way. I mean, you only have to look at The Expanse, the season 2 finale of Enterprise, which is the whole 9/11 thing pretty much straight on. It's, the Xindi probe coming, killing, obviously a lot more than the World Trade Center, about 8 million people, I think it is, cutting a swath through the world, through the Earth, killing Trip Tucker's sister, and leading the Enterprise on this, the whole mission of the third series in what they go and do. But it's that idea of something completely out of the blue, killing millions of innocent people and not being able to understand why this would happen. And that's exactly the response that people had after 9/11. Even though there were a lot of political and things behind that, the wars and the wars in the Middle East and these kind of things that had built up, Osama bin Laden ordering that attack, there still was that complete shock. And I think that's very much reflected in the path Enterprise goes down.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that episode, The Expanse, does a very good job of conveying that kind of, not just the horror of what's happened, but the kind of confusion and the, even with elements like the count of people who've been killed keeps getting revised, which was exactly what happened on 9/11. It keeps going up and up and up. But also there's this just bewilderment about it in a sense. It's kind of incomprehensible. Why has it happened? Where has it come from? And I think even it's actually Trip who asks immediately they find out what's happened. He says, did anyone say why? And Archer says, I didn't think to ask, actually. And obviously, eventually they sort of do find out there's a whole complex, elaborate story as to why. But at the same time, the initial reaction is very much this thing of, why has this happened to us? Why have we been attacked? Who is it who's got it in for us? What have we done to deserve this? Or what have we done to prompt this such a kind of outrageous attack kind of out of the blue, in a sense? I think it's quite interesting though with Enterprise. I mean, they were sort of caught off guard in a sense by 9/11. I mean, I think the Enterprise actually debuted the week after 9/11, didn't it? Or virtually around the same.
It was very close.
It was very close, and I think that did change everything. I mean, in terms of the way that Deep Space Nine or even Voyager, relate to the idea of terrorism. I mean, you're right. You have the Bajoran resistance, which, they do describe in terms of terrorism and terrorists. I mean, Kira talks to Thomas Riker when he's has joined the Marquis about being a good terrorist and how to function as a terrorist and what that's like. So they do use that word, and they they do kind of question the legitimacy of it and so on. But at the same time, I think because with the Bajorans, it's this resistance movement, there's a kind of, you know, no one is really going to side with the Cardassians against the Bajoran resistance, whether you might question some of the individual actions that they took or whether they went too far here or there or whatever. Their cause is clearly seen as a just one. You know, it was a noble thing to do. They are, I mean, it's not just the Bajorans who see them as heroes. You know, the viewer is you know, pretty much encouraged to see them in heroic terms, with maybe a few sort of, you know, it being Deep Space Nine, a few grey areas. I mean, I was watching in the last few days the Darkness and the Light, the Deep Space Nine episode where a Cardassian who's been kind of maimed by one of Kira's resistance cells attacks starts going after the people who are involved with it and killing them one by one and sort of trying to punish them. And his view is that basically he was a servant. He was, you know, he wasn't in the military. He was, you know, sort of domestic servant in a sense, and that he should not have been targeted. And Kira's response is, I suppose, twofold. I mean, the first thing is that they weren't really targeting him deliberately. He was kind of collateral damage in the sense they were targeting a military commander. But in the end, her response is basically, she says, you were all legitimate targets, and I don't care what your job was. You know, I don't care if you, she says, I don't care if you held a phaser in your hands or you ironed shirts for a living. You know, you were all guilty in a sense, and you all deserved what you got. And, you know, in some ways that's an understandable position for someone to take who is living under occupation, who has been, you know, brutalised, and their world has been stolen from them. And, you know, obviously we know about the kind of appalling things that went on in that situation. And then again with the Marquis, you know, there's, I mean, it's maybe a bit more of a kind of grey area with the Marquis as to how much we side with them, but certainly there's a lot of kind of heroism around the Marquis. There's a lot of kind of nobility around them. I mean, by the time you get to Voyager and half the crew are, you know, kind of coming from that background, it's very much something that, you know, that it may have been it was a sort of difference of opinion about what was the right way to deal with this treaty and so on. But, you know, they were doing what they felt was right. It was very much a means to an end. You know, they weren't killing people for the sake of it. They weren't killing people, you know, because they felt they deserved to die. They were very much in the spirit of the guy in the high ground, I suppose. They were trying to increase their negotiating power. They were trying to reverse this treaty that had been signed. They had quite clear political goals that were kind of not just understandable, but actually quite sympathetic in a sense. You know, that the audience would, and indeed often the characters would have quite a lot of sympathy with them, even if they, you know, didn't agree with the means that they were going about to do those things. I mean, you know, Cassidy Yates being a Marquis associate, you know, there's no moral judgment on her for being involved with that. It's presented as, you know, she's doing what she thinks is the right thing, and she has every reason for thinking that. But at the same time, it's a kind of complex political situation, and you know, it's illegal. She has to go to prison and so on. But, you know, very different, of course, by the time Enterprise comes around and is completely blindsided by 9/11 happening literally just as they're debuting. You know, the world did change, I think, and certainly our attitudes towards terrorism changed. And, you know, they couldn't have done those stories in Deep Space Nine after 9/11, I don't think, in the same ways. You know, the meaning of those words and our kind of associations and expectations were so different that, you know, a character like Kira, I don't know that would have been possible then.
I think what changed was the fact that the idea of that you've just talked about them having a cause, and Kira saying to those Cardassians, well, you know, you all were guilty. You all, doesn't matter who you are, you all deserve this. That analogy being applied to Western civilization off the back of a plane being driven into a building full of workers, full of innocent people, it's very hard to get behind that sentiment if you look at it from the viewpoint of Al-Qaeda or these other terrorist organisations, because the simple fact is, what have we done as a society, as a civilization, to warrant innocent people dying? They don't have a recognisable cause in the same way that an occupied world would have from our perspective. But if you go back, this is where going back in history, into the history books helps, because, you know, a lot of people don't understand the simple, you know, the trajectory of something like Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. You know, Osama bin Laden was Western educated. He was funded when he was in the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union. He was given the arms effectively by the United States, which he then used on the United States in many respects. There is a clear trajectory from somebody who, you know, in many respects was a sympathizer with forces trying to defeat, you know, the enemy, in inverted commas, in the Cold War, who then turned his entire ideology changed. So there's a lot of things that in the history of, you know, some of these terrorists, it doesn't make what they did right. Absolutely not, of course, and I'm not for 1 second justifying that. But at the same time, the reasons behind why they did what they did in 9/11 and the reasons behind, for instance, what the Zindi do are very different if you flip them on the other side. You know, and during Enterprise Season 3, there is an attempt to humanise some of the Zindi, to sort of make they're as much the victims of the sphere builders and the temporal Cold War as everybody else. But there's still no getting away from the fact that people sent out that probe and killed 8 million people. And there's no getting away from that simple fact. So there is, I think what 9/11 taught Star Trek and taught the world in general is that there is no easy answer to this. That if you look at it from different sides, there are going to be reasons on each one, but the other side can't fathom. You know, we can't as a Western society fathom why that man would want to go into Manchester Arena and blow up 20 young girls. You know, we can't fathom his rationale, his reason behind that. What could they possibly have done to warrant that? And that's what I think Star Trek has tried to reflect in the last few years.
And there is an element, you know, actually in all these stories of kind of questioning the sanity of the people who are perpetrating these crimes. I mean, you know, even in The High Ground, where, as I say, the terrorist seems quite rational. He seems to have quite a clear strategy. He's got a plan. He lays out exactly what he's trying to do. There still are conversations about, you know, Picard says, well, these people may not be rational. We may not be able to deal with them rationally. He has an argument with Beverly about whether the guy is mad or not. And, you know, he says it in a kind of dismissive way, you know, kind of he's mad. He doesn't necessarily literally mean he's mentally ill. But there is a kind of debate about how much there is a kind of a madness involved in it. And certainly in Enterprise, I mean, it's interesting, you know, you say that the Zindi attack and the whole arc of Season 3, obviously that's very inflected by 9/11 and the War on Terror and so on. But they do come to sort of give this explanation, which sort of does make rational sense. I mean, whether you agree morally with the decisions that they've taken and so on, there is a kind of logic to it. But then at the same time, they also bring in this other episode, Chosen Realm, where they also deal with terrorism. They deal with suicide bombing. They deal with very, you know, contemporary issues around terrorism, but in a very different way, in a much less rational way, because these are religious fanatics and they're kind of dealing with religious extremism and fanaticism, and in a kind of very sort of traditional Gene Roddenberry sort of Star Trek way, in a sense. This is an episode that is very anti-religion in a sense. I mean, I don't mean it's anti all religion, but you know, the kind of conclusion of it is very much these people's faith is sort of ludicrous. These people's faith has driven them to commit these extreme crimes. They can't be reasoned with. They won't listen to sense. They're anti-science, which by implication they're sort of anti-Star Trek in a sense, because Star Trek is all about science. And they're very much more, they remind me in some ways, most of, you know, these days we sort of moved on from dealing with Al-Qaeda to dealing with ISIS. And there's an element of that kind of, I think with ISIS, this, you know, because we hear not only about the unspeakable crimes that they commit and the kind of, you know, executions and all these terrible things, but also the destruction of ancient sites, the destruction of monuments, of art, of culture, of all these sort of things. And these people very much have the same kind of slightly Philistine attitude. Their hatred of science. They delete all of the files Enterprise has been gathering on the spheres, which we know they need to complete their mission. So there's this kind of sort of rabid, insane religious fanaticism about them, which is kind of is not. It's not about a means to an end. It's literally like, well, this person deserves to die. You know, they say they've desecrated a sphere. They've in some sort of mystical religious sense, they're casting judgment on people and punishing them. And in all those ways, that episode feels very much, you know, tied into the kind of, you know, talking about, we keep going back to this idea, what do the terrorists want? What do the terrorists believe? What are their feelings about the victims and so on? This is very much the kind of modern version of terrorism, in a sense that as much as, yes, you can to some extent contextualise events like 9/11 in terms of, you know, Anglo-American foreign policy in the years leading up to it. Yes, you know, obviously a lot of people would say, you know, as long as we're sending drones in that are killing people in certain countries, they're helping to radicalise other people. There is all that element to it, but at the same time, there are also people who seem to have absorbed a kind of toxic ideology that is, almost kind of nihilistic. And certainly with these people, we see very much this kind of religious fanaticism and the impossibility of really dealing with that in any kind of rational way.
Which is really, as you say, it's really topical in many respects, because the modern idea of the modern terrorist of ISIS is very much, in their eyes, built on this idea of religious fanaticism, of using the Quran and using Islam as their justification for this, kind of this holy war against, the Western society and things like that. When the reality is, as many, millions of Muslim people will tell you, and most people who actually, read up on this and Islam and the Quran and educate themselves know that it's probably the most peace-loving, religion in the world of all of them. It really doesn't espouse anything like this. So it is that whole idea of taking something, twisting it for your own ends, whatever end that may be, and then, going out there and doing these unspeakable crimes in the guise of something else. And and again, it goes back to the complete, lack of understanding as to why this would be done. But the other element that Star Trek has touched on, and we mentioned this before, but most recently in Star Trek Into Darkness, the second J.J. Abrams movie, they touched on the response. And I think that film is very much a response to the growing... I mean, obviously it came out in the, during the Obama administration, but it kind of almost presaged the Trump administration and how they've been dealing with Syria lately. In Admiral Marcus is a clear example of the hawkish, right-wing, Republican, hardline government who consider missiles and bombing to be the answer to terrorist attacks. Obviously, he's corrupt, he's involved with Section 31 and Khan and all this kind of thing. But it's interesting watching that film and seeing that he's effectively a Section 31 agent under the guise of being a Starfleet admiral with his massive, gunship, the Vengeance. And it's interesting that that film very much tries to sort of position him as almost like an internal renegade, almost as somebody who doesn't espouse the ideals of the Federation, and he is kind of like he's not a fugitive, he's not a renegade, but he's operating under a very different set of principles. So it kind of, in a way, vindicates Starfleet's involvement in this. But to me, it's still the same idea. It's still exploring the same idea that his initial response to Kirk is go to that planet, bomb it, and that'll be the solution. And that is something that I don't think we'd seen quite as directly in Star Trek before.
And there is that whole debate. I mean, Scotty basically resigns, doesn't he? Because he's not happy using these weapons that he's not even allowed to open them. He doesn't even know what they are. There's this kind of, militarized element to it that is kind of seen as quite distasteful in that, exactly as you said, that sort of hawkish way. I mean, I find it surprising. I'm not a big fan of the JJ films. I like Beyond, but the other two I could really do without, and especially the kind of loud, brash, I call them Star Trek troopers. It's that kind of very militarized, very kind of in your face, sort of action heavy approach that they have, which to me doesn't really feel very Star Trek. But at the same time, Into Darkness, which I don't like as a film, politically I feel like I'm more sympathetic to it than I am to the treatment of the same issues in Enterprise, bizarrely. And I know that the season 3 of Enterprise, that whole Xindi arc, it polarized people. A lot of people were very uncomfortable with it, particularly in the sort of early period before they started working towards resolution. I mean, I think maybe we talked about this in our first episode, that John Billingsley, for example, who plays Dr. Phlox, he was very uncomfortable with some of the directions they were going in, with exactly in that kind of context of, you mentioned 24, kind of, stories like 24 that seemed to defend some of the actions of the Bush administration in terms of torture and, they called it enhanced interrogation techniques, seem to be very much on board with those kind of things that traditionally you would probably expect Star Trek as a kind of liberal, fairly left-wing program to be, to take quite a strong line against. And I wonder if part of it, though, is that, as I said before, they were really caught off guard by 9/11. And obviously, 9/11 was a deeply traumatic sort of global historical event and something that people struggle to process with and to know, what to make of and how to respond to. And I mean, it's interesting. It really took them on Enterprise quite some time to engage with it directly. I mean, there was a kind of a hint of it at the end of the first season, in the episode Shockwave. There's a very strong visual echo of 9/11. The last shot of that episode, their Archer is in this planet in the future he's in Earth, I think, in the future that's been sort of devastated, and the iconography of it is very reminiscent of the Twin Towers, of those kind of twisted girders reaching up to the sky. So they kind of touch on it there, and also in that episode there's a kind of, at the beginning there's this what's taken to be an accident in which 3,000 people are killed, and again maybe there's this sort of slight, sort of subtle connection there somehow, that this act, which does turn out to have been deliberate and is a kind of, a deliberate act that's killed these people, has killed a sort of comparable number of people, and there's a comparable kind of shock around it. But really it takes them 2 years to head on deal with this massive issue, this massive event that's affected the world in this very profound way. And I suppose probably they felt that Star Trek had this responsibility. I mean, in the 1960s, they were dealing with contemporary issues around Vietnam and so on. Star Trek has always supposedly been able to, take things, rip from the headline stories and find a way of processing that. But for whatever reason with Enterprise, it took them quite a while to work out how to do that. I mean, compared to, for example, The West Wing, which literally had a special episode out within 2 weeks of 9/11. They shot a whole, an episode outside of continuity. So it basically doesn't actually fit anywhere in the storyline, because it didn't fit, with the episode that had been broadcast before, or the one afterwards, which had already been scripted. But they wrote this kind of little, sort of like a TV play, I suppose, kind of looking at some of the issues, some of the questions, and arguably it's probably not the best episode of The West Wing, but it was certainly well intentioned, and it certainly came out of this idea of this monumental thing has happened, we need to say something about it. We can't just carry on as normal and sort of pretend it hasn't taken place. And especially writing these kind of fictional narratives, I mean, the real American presidency and the American country and the world had been sort of plunged into this situation, and in a way, when you've got a fictitious American presidency going on as normal or dealing with totally unrelated issues, it maybe feels kind of strange that the fiction can't relate to that. I mean, I remember there was a whole issue about in comic books, why wasn't Superman there on 9/11 to save the day? How do you sort of explain that in the context of that world? And is it really possible to just pretend that something so momentous never happened? Because at a certain point, it is part of human history, and it's got to be reflected in fiction that sort of seemingly takes place in the real world.
This whole topic, I think, just is so expansive. I think it's something that Star Trek is going to be wrestling with, for a long time to come, especially as, the 21st century, the idea of what terrorism is develops and changes. And the sad thing is, I don't think it's going to go away. And I think, events like Manchester prove increasingly that these issues are so far away from being resolved and so far away from having any kind of understanding on both sides that we're going to get this happen. And it's almost become a generational thing. It's almost become something that, for an entire legion of and often quite young radicalised people, is a way of life, is a route to success, in inverted commas. If you look at, certainly ISIS and the way they recruit and the radicalisation there. And it's a terrifying uncertainty, really, that I think Star Trek is going to continue reflecting in many of its stories. And we saw a little bit of the idea, not in the same way as Into Darkness, but in Beyond, it was that idea of a complete force taking, the Enterprise by surprise. And it was a very different kind of thing. It wasn't terrorism per se, but it's still that playing with that idea of something completely knocking you for six. And then, the question is it going to play a part in Discovery, later this year? Are we going to see these kind of fears and these kind of, ideas reflected in this new series?
Well, absolutely. I suppose it's true with Beyond. You do get a sense, partly that the attack sort of comes out of the blue, but also the fact that it involves, many, many small. It's not one big ship, because it's this swarm of little ships. There is, I know it's not really a suicide attack, but there's a kind of element of it that ties into that idea, because they are literally, it sort of seems like a kind of mass kamikaze attack in a sense, doesn't it? The way it's ripping through the ship and so on. And it's very much, these individuals playing their small part and causing mayhem and destruction. It's not like a general on the battlefield or kind of a ship going into battle with another ship. It is more sort of on the level of the individual suicide bomber who's been radicalised or who's been, persuaded to play their part in this kind of scheme and to attack people in that way. And certainly, I mean, who knows how this may or may not play out in Discovery, but one of the big questions, I suppose, is that's hard to answer, and that really we keep talking about what do the terrorists want, or what the terrorists thinking, or what do they want us to do, or what do we want to make them think that we're going to do, or whatever. The other thing is to try to understand this process of radicalisation. I mean, how does it happen? Because with this this man who carried out the attack in Manchester, we've seen, as is often the case, people who went to school with him saying, oh, he seemed like a normal kid, he didn't seem particularly extreme. And there's a sort of process that happens where, it's like grooming in a sense, isn't it? It's a kind of grooming process in a sense. It's a kind of, almost a kind of brainwashing. I mean, in our second episode, we were talking about the Manchurian Candidate. It's not quite on that level of literally roboticizing someone, but there is an element of, there are people who are feeding these ideas, who are trying to kind of indoctrinate people into this kind of ideology and into these views about what is and isn't acceptable, and what kind of a moral code that is so alien to 99% of kind of ordinary people around the world, in a sense. But it is this kind of process. And I mean, one of the things obviously that I suppose the future Star Trek could try and deal with is, we saw obviously in Deep Space Nine the kind of undercover Marquis. We saw Eddington working for the Marquis. We saw Cassidy Yates, helping the Marquis. But that's sort of one thing, because we can understand why they would do that. We can understand why they would feel sympathy for the Marquis. We can understand why they would feel morally that was the right thing to do. This process of kind of radicalisation from someone who's grown up in, Western culture, someone who's born and bred in Britain, essentially, and yet can be kind of corrupted mentally, morally, in that kind of way, is a very complex and fascinating topic. And, obviously that's something that they could kind of look at in future Star Trek, is something about that kind of process of, how do you lose someone like that? Do you know what I mean? How do you lose them as part of your kind of common humanity, that they go, not just to a kind of political betrayal, or a kind of, it's not just to betray your country, it's to betray your whole kind of, the whole sort of assumptions about what we have about what it means to live as human beings, and, what kind of acceptable behaviour is, to the extent that, with this attack in the last week, I mean, however much you might try to understand the, in different situations, different terrorists, I mean, like, I find it hard to comprehend someone who wants to kill people like you and me, but there is something, I think, even worse about someone who wants to kill small children and thinks that that's acceptable, and that they would choose them as because they do have a choice about who they're targeting. That is kind of, because it suggests that there's no, I suppose, if you were seeing it as kind of a means to an end, if you were seeing it maybe as Kira does in Deep Space Nine to a certain extent, of, well, I had to do awful things because, the cause was just and I had a reason for doing it, and, I felt bad about it, but, whatever, or like the guy in the high ground, then you would choose, you would make decisions to try to either to cause the least harm, or at least you would choose your targets in some ways. You would have some view of what a legitimate target is. Kira says the guy who folds the shirts for a living is still a legitimate target because he's working for the Cardassian. Okay, that's one thing. But, she wouldn't be going and targeting a school full of Cardassian children. There are boundaries. And I suppose, the other thing that's maybe difficult about these issues is obviously, terrorism is horrific and awful. And, I don't want to get into trying to defend any of these people in the real world or in Star Trek or any of it, in a sense. But at the same time, people are making decisions. They are making choices. And in a sense, we can't really ignore those facts of it. We can't really ignore that people are choosing to kind of cross a line that other people wouldn't. I mean, even in the Enterprise episode in Chosen Realm that we were talking about, there's this point where the fanatical leader is trying to say to Archer, look, we're very much the same, you've crossed your own moral boundaries, you've done things that you didn't think you would ever do. And then he reveals that he actually killed a child in order to protect a kind of military operation, and Archer obviously is horrified. And we talked earlier about that episode, in a previous episode we discussed the episode Hatchery, where there's a kind of discussion about the ethics of killing children in war, and even in the High Ground it comes up, because they talk about this terrorist group has bombed a bus full of children, and they have this sort of discussion about, well, they said they didn't mean to kill the children, it was, they thought that they were police or something and it was an accident. But and the woman who's the policewoman in that story is sort of saying, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter, what they did was awful, I don't care whether they meant to or not. On the other hand, not to defend someone who kills a load of children by accident, but it is different from someone who does it deliberately. And I suppose really that's all, with all these things that we've been talking about, that's the kind of thing I keep coming back to, is this idea. I think we need to try to avoid the kind of simplifying narratives, try to avoid the kind of knee-jerk responses, whether on the negative side or even on the positive side, and just try to recognise, I suppose, the complexity and the difficult side of these things. And these are very upsetting, heartbreaking things that have happened, but they're also things not to sort of shy away from, and not to try and comfort ourselves by just trotting out, certain phrases that we've heard everyone say a million times without really thinking about them. And I don't know, try to have a sort of honest response to these things. And, if something appalling and awful happens, try to accept that and acknowledge that, but also kind of take an interest in it, try to understand it. Maybe it can't be understood in those kind of ways, but, at least try to have an open mind in terms of, how we respond, what our responsibilities are, not just kind of buy into this sort of dogma, well-meaning as it might be.
Well, I think as well, off the back of that, the key thing to remember is, and you mentioned this just a minute ago, the people who do this, it is an individual decision, or it's a choice of individual decisions based on a group, a collective group with an agenda or with whatever. It's not representative of us versus them. It's not the idea that these people represent a completely different way of life, or represent a completely different race, or represent they don't. These people, that man who blew himself up, chose to do that. He didn't do that in the name of the entire face of Islam. He didn't do that in the name of every Muslim person on the planet. And unfortunately, there are people who buy into the rhetoric of that, and who fear, who are bred to fear. And if there is a goal that they might want, part of it could well be that people do buy into that fear. And like you said, it is difficult to prescribe one specific reason, and it should be avoided. But there is that idea that if we choose to think in those terms, then we're not really going to get anywhere. We're not really going to progress. It should always be remembered, I think, that these people choose, and whatever it is, whether it's the real world, whether it's a lot of these characters in Star Trek, they make these choices. They choose to do these things themselves, and ultimately, the accountability is on them and on their actions, their morality, and all of these different things. And I think if Star Trek keeps shining a light on these stories, hopefully as it continues, whether it's in the movies or whether it's on TV, I think in its own way it'll help. It'll help us try and figure out what is probably the biggest problem of this century.
Because as you say, it's not, unfortunately, something that it looks like it's going to go away anytime soon. It is going to be with us, this situation, this problem, for some time. And I guess that is one of the things that Star Trek can do. It can sort of shine a light on things, often by taking them in an allegorical way, or looking at them slightly obliquely. It can kind of give us new perspectives on things. And with something as emotive and difficult to deal with and difficult to comprehend as terrorism, I think that can only be helpful to have new perspectives, new stories, new ways of looking at that issue and questioning it and thinking about it. Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's been an enlightening discussion, a very topical and difficult discussion, really. And I think I speak on behalf of Duncan that my heart goes out to all those people who lost their lives and their families, and it's desperately sad. And I think it's a good discussion to have, though, and as you say, it's great that we've got Star Trek there to actually try and help us work through this a little bit in these really difficult times. So let's hope this is a discussion that people may take, if they've been affected by this, may take some solace in. So unfortunately, this sad topic isn't the only thing, though, that has been going on this week on the network. So here's a little look at what else has been happening this week on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
It's interesting how they're doing the casting, but I think it would be nice to actually have two ships involved, because one thing that I feel Star Trek has long suffered from, even with Deep Space Nine, which did try to break out of it a bit, is that small world syndrome.
Standard Orbit.
And Jim Carrey, as they're fighting, he's like singing along. He's like, brah, brah. As he's fighting, he's singing along as he's fighting Matthew Broderick. And man, it's just so good. Like, to me, that's like, when I think of Star Trek and pop culture, like, that's the first scene that I think of in The Cable Guy there.
The Orb.
This is another thing that we're seeing all over the world, but this whole idea that just because something is hard, we should avoid it. But that is absolutely untrue. I mean, just look at your life, look at my life, I look at anybody's life, and the things where people have learned the most have been the hard things.
To the journey!
Wait, you're saying it's like matter and antimatter when they interact? They
it's like costume
annihilate
or
each
non-costume.
other. So costumes and non-costumes annihilate each other.
Yes.
In Voyager.
Exactly. That is how the universe is going to ultimately be destroyed, due to the interaction of naked people and people wearing clothes.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended, all right.